Well, good afternoon to you. And it's only the presence of the foreign minister that immediately after a luncheon session, we still have a full hall, and we have a very wide variety of interesting questions people have in mind. Thank you for agreeing. We are deeply honored, Foreign Minister, that this is the third Kautilya Economic Conclave. And one of the very abiding, continuing links has been your presence and has been the final session always, people which have greatly looked forward to this concluding session. Let me begin this conversation by asking you a slightly offbeat question, if I might. You decided to join the Indian Foreign Service. Perhaps I made the wrong choice, but whatever.
I wouldn't say that.
Whatever that might be.
But you can say it. It's okay.
What prompted you to join the Indian Foreign Service, considering the multiplicity of variety and other choices which you had?
You mean join the government or within the government?
Within the government, decide to join the Indian Foreign Service.
I'd say, in a way, curiosity about the world. I actually studied international relations, which was a little bit unusual for most others. Most people had studied other subjects. So I already had a degree of involvement, intellectual involvement with the world. I also suppose, in a way, I grew up in a household where there was a lot of interest about the world. It was, in what you read, in the music you heard. At that time, not the friends you had, that came later. So it was already there in a way. And when you join the government, for those of you who are not familiar, you have a choice between taking a domestic stream or a international foreign policy stream, and I chose that. It was not something I was particularly conflicted on. I mean, it seemed fairly obvious to me.
All right. Pursuing that same strain, you were greatly influenced by your father, which is understandable, in multiple ways. Now, he was a person who had combined in a certain sense, the foresight of seeing how the world will evolve and how security considerations will increasingly play a more dominant role in shaping policies. In that sense, was that an important influence on you also, Minister?
Partly because, fathers are dominant figures in everybody's life. But equally influential figures are mothers. My mother actually, whether it was my reading or particularly music, my mother studied music. She was very much influenced. Her life revolved around music. So I think I got the sort of the hard politics, strategy, the world history from my father. I got the world literature, music, world culture from my mother, and I guess some of it stuck. So there I am.
All right. Coming to some of the more contemporary issues, you are just back, Minister, from after addressing, perhaps for the umpteenth time, the General Assembly of the United Nations. You have seen the United Nations evolve and yet not evolve. Seems to have been caught, as you rightly said, a time warp. United Nations is perhaps the apex multilateral institution, but in general there has been a decline in multilateralism. How do you see the future of global cooperative framework with the great amount of reluctance and recalcitrance on the part of multilateral institutions, particularly the United Nations, to evolve?
Well, since this is an economic conclave, let me give you a business-like answer. The UN, in a way, is like an old company, not entirely keeping up with the market, but occupying the space. And when it's behind times, in this world you have startups and innovation, so different people start doing their own things. Now, they would like to mainstream that into the market and see that the, principal players are in tune with these trends. But when they are not, I think countries, as companies do, start doing their own thing. So what you have today is, yes, there is a UN. At the end of the day, however suboptimal it is in functioning, it's still the only multilateral game in town. But when it doesn't step up on key issues, countries figure out their own ways of doing it. So if you look, for example, let's take the last 5 or 10 years. Probably the biggest thing which happened in our lives was COVID. Now, think about what did the UN do on COVID, and I think the answer is not very much. Now, you have 2 conflicts going on in the world today, 2 very serious conflicts. Where is the UN on them? Essentially a bystander. So what is happening is that, as you saw even during COVID, countries either did their own thing, or you had an initiative like COVAX, which was done by a group of countries. When it comes to the big issues of the day, I think increasingly you find combinations of countries who come together and say, let's agree on this and let's go and do it. So you have, let us say, connectivity, and you have something like IMEC. So you have India, Middle Eastern countries, European countries, US doing their thing. You have, say, in the Indo-Pacific, how do you, look after the global commons? So you have the Quad, which does its own thing. You had even in climate action, you had the International Solar Alliance. You have the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, all bodies which came from outside the UN framework. So I think today the UN will continue, but increasingly there's a non-UN space, which is the active space, and I think it's telling on the UN.
Well, I think that, you began your response to this question by mentioning that you will perhaps, since this is a Kautilya Economic Conclave, focus a bit on the economic aspects of it. Pursuing in that same strain, one of the very high points, which you yourself have mentioned, under the G20 presidency of India, was the arrangement which was agreed on for reforming the multilateral development banks. You have spoken about it. How do you see that in contrast, that notwithstanding the fact that the recommendations of a specialized committee was accepted by the G20, the progress and the appetite of the major shareholders has been very suboptimal? And where do you therefore see these multilateral development banks going in a larger framework?
First of all, I think it was very good that in the last year and a half, we had that progress, we had that direction, that momentum. In a sense, the Brazilian presidency is picking up on it, hopes to take it forward. But because you spoke about the UN, I do want to say we came out of something called the Summit of the Future. It produced a document called the Pact of the Future, and what that entire exercise revealed was really a great sense of frustration in large parts of the world, whether actually their problems are getting heard, recognized, and are there solutions in the making. I think there's a general sense, people know by sort of gut instinct that these are where the solutions lie, and which a large part of it is the MDB reform. But again, here's the reality. The reality is that in global politics, there is, at the end of the day, limited bandwidth. There are one or two issues which suck up much of the oxygen. I think we've seen that now for 2.5 years in Ukraine and in the last year in the Middle East. So what is happening, when I met virtually all my G20 colleagues during the UNGA, and that kind of push which there should be, that kind of prioritization that there should be on MDB reform, I have to be honest, I didn't exactly get that sense. Instead, the focus, I think Middle East was the #1 issue, Ukraine was the #2 issue, even climate kind of dropped in the priority.
In a very recent book for which you wrote a foreword on Prime Minister Modi's leadership of the South, and looking in the context of India's new role, the balancing role perhaps in the raging conflicts which exist, how do you see that you would maneuver and seek the kind of equilibrium and balance and recalibration for which the world has applauded you in providing leadership with the raging conflicts in Asia, raging conflicts in Europe, no end is seen? And how do you see going forward will be the compact of the Global South, the India's intermediation role, and the leadership which it can give?
I'm sort of dividing your proposition into two. One is what can we do in respect of the problem? And number two, what can we do for ourselves? So when it comes to the problems, I think it's fairly apparent that the levels of globalization have reached a point where it's very difficult for any serious issue to be contained locally or even regionally. So if you have a war in Ukraine, it doesn't stay in Central Europe or even in Europe or even in the West. If you have something in the Middle East, it doesn't stay in the Middle East. So if you look at, let us say, what's happening now and compare it to, 1973, of course, you had the oil issues, but 67 and 73, when there were conflicts in the Middle East, it was a much simpler, much more contained conflict than what we are seeing today. So the first issue is, what do you do if the entire world is going to get affected by big problems? Do you remain impassive? Do you say, okay, we'll wait for it to play out? Or do countries who can make a difference, or at least try to make a difference, do they step forward and try and do it? I would argue that today's day and age and the nature of globalization and the stakes involved and the impact that it has on the entire world, especially on the Global South, those who can try to make a difference should try and do it. And to some extent, that's been the logic, the driving force, the thinking behind some of our activities, say, for example, in respect of Ukraine, which is in the last few months, you've actually had Prime Minister meet President Zelensky 3 times. This is in his 3rd term since June. He's met Putin once, he's spoken to him more often, and the NSA and myself, we've been in touch. And the reason we are doing it is we are one of the few countries, and Prime Minister Modi is one of the few leaders who today has the ability to actually go to Kyiv and Moscow and talk to the two leaders and see, are there common points? Is there something we can start? Is there some convergence, some intersection that we can see, which can become a strand which you pick up and try and develop, and see whether things could be better than they are. Surely they can't be worse than they are. Middle East is more tricky in a way because the conflict itself is, there are more parties, not all of them are formal. and not all of them acknowledge their role in what they're doing. But again, it's not that we have been uninvolved. I mean, at various times, we have played some role in, if nothing else, in communication between countries, some of whom for political, historical reasons don't communicate with each other. So there is that. So I would say, the reason, again, I connect it up with your Global South observation. The Global South is, because it is the Global South, feeling the pain much more of a global society and a global economy under stress. They would like somebody to do something about it. To the extent that you have a country like India which understands, which is coming in a sense from that family, which understands their concerns, is able to put it across, I think they're very happy about it. They do, clearly support a lot of our initiatives. It was very visible in the UN. From an Indian perspective, what do we get out of it? I think it's in the nature of our situation, the way in which we are trying to manage our rise, is that it's important that we are really connected to all the major players. We are seen as a country with a greater sense of responsibility towards the global polity. And it's part of India's own, I would say, evolution.
Well, looking in a broader sense of the term, Minister, it is more often than not, it is said that in the typology of growth, perhaps the choices which were made by India in first emphasizing the primary sector, then moving on to the secondary and tertiary sector, it generally believed that the great moments when manufacturing could have been given higher priority. Somehow or the other, we were latecomers in not exactly being part of that fast-moving bus. Technology has now overtaken in many ways, and therefore countries are revisiting this whole issue of the credibility of global supply chain and how reliable they can be. And so looking forward, how do you see this kind of a balance between, on the one hand, India trying to, so to say, for purposes of employment, catching the missed manufacturing bus with the onslaught of technology in a seamless way?
Well, I think you put your finger on it, but I would actually perhaps broaden it out even more. Because from a governance perspective, I think a lot of our challenges are how do you simultaneously address the legacy issues of the past, the challenges of the near past and the present, and the possibilities of the future. Now, I'd give you very concrete examples. We are still in many ways looking at, issues relating to health, to nutrition, to literacy, which eventually impinge on the quality of human resources. Now, there are other countries in this continent who prioritized many of those issues ahead of us, who were willing to make that kind of political and resource commitment, for example, to literacy, and have reaped the benefits of it. So I would say before we missed, or we were late, missed the manufacturing bus, I think we were also late in boarding the literacy bus. And I'm giving you literacy only. I mean, I'm not even talking universal primary health, for example. So today we are still, if you look at the achievements of the last decade, if you say from the multidimensional poverty index, we've got 250 million people out. Yes, it's great, but it's something which ideally, actually, previous governments and previous dispensations should have done. It should have left us in a much better position than having to deal with problems which others had sorted out before. I mean, the same would apply in many of the big initiatives we are doing, piped water, electricity, etc. I mean, These ideally should have been tackled by now. Okay, it doesn't matter, we've inherited it, we are now dealing with it. Now, the manufacturing, I would say, is the near past and in a way the present. Yes, I think, missed the manufacturing bus, the kind of opportunities we could have had much earlier. If you had done the earlier bit right, would have positioned you well. And I think it's important to recognize, because without a large country which doesn't have manufacturing is not in the right position then to deal with technology. If it is our assumption, rightly, that we are looking today into a different world, a world which is much more tech-centric, then that kind of contribution and that kind of benefit you cannot reap if you don't have an industrial culture, and that kind of industrial culture won't come if you don't have the manufacturing. So, if you see the totality today of what the government, the Modi government is trying to do, you are looking at the quality of human resources, very basic things from nutrition onwards to housing. You are looking at the kind of infrastructure. We also missed the infrastructure bus. That catching up on infrastructure, doing, one of the big decisions taken in these first 100 days of the government was to create 12 big industrial zones in this country and tie that up with appropriate infrastructure. And then we are pushing this skilling, through skill programs and internships so that you have the HR accompaniment of that. So you have to get the manufacturing, you have to get the HR, you've got to get the infrastructure, you've got to get the global capability centers and the joint ventures coming in, because all of this will add up to position you for the world that is coming. And the world that is coming, I think, is such a fundamental change that, at least, I know this is an economic conclave, but I would say, as someone in international relations, AI is probably going to be the most profound factor in the global order, probably since nuclear weapons came. That the race for AI is as deadly serious as the race for nuclear weapons was. And whoever has the lead on that is actually going to have an enormous benefit in the global order.
Well, thank you for some of those overarching themes, but people obviously expect that there are some specific issues on which we would seek your comments. Looking at the raging conflict now in the Middle East, the possibilities of a wider conflagration which might take place given the Iran situation and unsettled, do you really think that the initiative taken by Prime Minister Modi, and for which you provided a great degree of support, on the India-Middle East-Europe economic corridor, is it only a question of having more patience till things settle down? Or do you think that this will require a basic recalibration?
There are two ways of looking at it. Today is October 6th. Tomorrow is exactly a year since the terrorist attacks on Israel took place. And as a result of that, the kind of focus that we were expecting early on the IMEC probably didn't happen. Which is not to say the IMEC is dead or that it is discarded or it is even in the freezer. In fact, I've been both to Saudi Arabia and to the UAE. We have right now projects going on with the UAE on IMEC, and there are some feasibility studies initiated with the Saudis. But I would actually turn it around. My sense, and this is a sense of talking to the Europeans in the Middle East, people both in business and in policy. What has the conflict of the last year shown? The conflict of the last year has shown that actually the risks are much higher than we thought. The risks are not just, because you have one Suez Canal which everybody is using. Tomorrow it could be conflict, it could be extreme climate events, it could be disruptions of various kinds. You have a bunch of people sitting in Yemen who are firing drones and missiles who can actually jeopardize global shipping. Now, I think the multiplicity of risks because of the proliferation of various technologies and other factors. As I said, even climate is today something you've got to take into account in global logistics. That I think the case for the corridor has actually become stronger, not weaker. In fact, I would argue that corridor will be clearly a very big idea in which a lot of countries are invested. Therefore, I expect to see it move much faster. But there are other corridors as well. I mean, for India, there are corridors eastwards. We are trying to build a land corridor all the way up to Vietnam. There's a corridor by sea that we are looking at. I mean, if the polar melting actually is going to again open up passages which could not have been envisaged. So, when I look at what are the big things which would change this decade, I referred to AI earlier, I would put actually connectivity. Connectivity changer, demographics, connectivity, AI. These are really going to, by the end of this decade, very, very profoundly changed the global order.
Initially when Minister you had come for the first Kautilya Economic Conclave, the Quad was still taking shape. It was its initial phases, it was the inception. Recently now you have attended important Quad meeting. Mm-hmm. How do you see the Quad evolve as an important fulcrum in terms of all the players in the Quad and the fulcrum for both economic and political and defense security?
Well, the Quad is not, Quad's really very, very broad-based, because the nice thing about Quad is that it's like a sort of an open architecture. There's no legal document. There's no piece of paper that anybody signed which said, I hereby join the Quad on these terms. It's not treaty-based. It doesn't have a secretariat. So, in a sense, it defies all conventional models of institutionalized cooperation. And I would argue precisely because it does that. It's been very innovative. People have been able to come up with ideas. It's been driven very actively through regular sort of virtual consultations, sometimes physical ones. And if you look today at the kind of agenda the Quad has, it's huge. I mean, it's from, I would say, from telecom and connectivity and, climate action projects, to education, to technology, to maritime safety, security. We would have maybe at least 50, 60, 70 different domains today covered by the Quad. So what it has done, is it's partly because I think multilateral has failed, plurilateral has come into its own. And in this particular case, I think the fact that it's not a treaty-based organization, I think has been very, very helpful for its growth. Today, I would actually regard Quad as one of the really key mechanisms in the Indo-Pacific. And I can see that it's, that perception is increasingly shared by other countries. So many other countries want to have to, are interested in interacting in some way with the Quad.
In a couple of weeks from now, you would be, Minister, going to travel to Kazan to participate in the next meeting of the BRICS. Mm-hmm. The BRICS has expanded and the room is increasingly becoming more crowded. Do you think that with the expansion of the BRICS, to which we supported the expansion of the BRICS also, it will still remain a meaningful kind of, at least a meaningful kind of a way in which you can have conversations, come to conclusions, and hopefully thereafter some policy which would be relevant?
Yes, I think we do. I think it's a bit like, those of us who are members of clubs, it's very rare to be a member of a single club. A lot of us like to go to different clubs. Each club has its own special points. So I think the BRICS is a different combination. The membership is different. The atmosphere is different. The agenda is different. The Quad is different. Now, if we have the ability to go to more clubs, I would say that's good for us. So the expansion of the BRICS, because there's huge interest. I mean, we are looking at how do we take that expansion further in the coming BRICS meeting, which doesn't necessarily mean more members, but the fact is that the interest that countries show today in joining BRICS also tells us something. It tells us that many others today want multiple options. They want to have a larger spread in terms of their relationships. I think that's the world we are moving into. So it is a world, when we say, look, it's not just the UN that is getting old. I think the global order itself is getting old. So the kind of what was the norm of the 1940s and 50s, that you have alliances, that you have written documents, that you have clearly defined obligations, you have exclusive relationships, that you will only work with those set of people and not with these set of people. I think all of this is changing. So again, I cannot overstate to you today the cumulative impact of the forces of change. Technology is changing, connectivity is changing, the economy is changing, the international relationship, and they're all playing on each other.
We are gratified that you just returned from Sri Lanka yesterday or this morning, I don't know, but thank you very much that immediately after that you have spared your time. What do you see the Sri Lankan economy, considering the fact that it's a very important integral part of our entire framework of regional cooperation? And what are your impressions of the new government in Sri Lanka?
Well, I think the Sri Lankans have, they were in really very, very difficult situation. And there's very widespread appreciation of the fact that India stepped forward early, India stepped forward massively, and India stepped forward unconditionally at that time to support them. And then, that, of course, positioned them as well for what the EFF with the IMF. Now, they are midway through that program. It has its, it has its discipline, it has its requirements. So that's for them, to deal with. In fact, when I was there, the IMF team was also there. But where we are concerned, we are one of the co-chairs of the OCC. We've been very supportive of the need for Sri Lanka to be, facilitated through this. And obviously, the Sri Lankan government has its responsibilities as well to fulfill. Now, in terms of the impact of the new government, it's hard to say because you had the presidential election, the parliament elections are due on the 14th of November. So right now everybody is looking at that because it's only when that is completed that you can say the political transition has fully happened. But I met the president and the prime minister, the new president, the new prime minister, and the new foreign minister. And I think they are cognizant of their predicament. They do understand the seriousness of the challenge that they have. But they also, have a certain outlook and a certain philosophy, and they have to see how they are able to harmonize all of that.
Well, embedded in this Sri Lankan episode or story is a larger issue which you are aware of the huge debt overhang of many countries in our region. And that, of course, requires a concerted solution and an orderly solution. Equally, I think there are other challenges in this region. You would have had contacts with the newly formed government in Bangladesh during your stay in New York and elsewhere. And what are your thoughts on the going forward on the Bangladesh-India equation?
Look, that's different from Sri Lanka, obviously. When I was in New York, I met their advisor for foreign affairs, and we had a discussion, and the summary of it was really, on their side, stress on the importance of cooperation with India. On our side, affirmation of the fact that we believe structurally our relationship is so strong that there could be political ups and downs, but we think that the structure is sound enough to absorb all of that. Now, exactly how we're going to go forward in the relationship, I think that remains to be worked out, because the main contacts we've had are really the meeting in New York and what our ambassador has been having in Dhaka. So I think it's a bit early for me to really predict the course of that. But by and large, I would say this, that if you look at our neighborhood, with one notable exception, countries of the neighborhood in the last decade actually have regionalized much more deeply than they have done in the last 7 or 8 decades, since independence for us. And the impact of that and the impact of the size of the Indian economy and the willingness of India really to step out and do things for its neighbors and for the rest of the world, I think that is today shaping people's thinking, that whether it was Sri Lanka in economic distress or the fertilizer shortages after the Ukraine war started, or the vaccine demands during COVID, there is that broader regional sense, okay, there's an India, we can ask India, it's a country that is there for us. And I would say in that sense, we are both a lifting tide as well as, it's a paradoxical metaphor, but a ballast as well for the region.
Well, you did make the remark en passé, and without, I will be more specific, with one exception. But, Foreign Minister, you're traveling to Pakistan after a long time. No doubt you have clarified, papers have carried it fully, that you're only going to talk about the framework of the Shanghai Cooperation Council, for which you are primarily going there. But frankly speaking, although diplomacy is inscrutable, opaque science and art, is it possible to keep the bilateral completely distinct from the other sort of issues which our relationship has been bedeviled with?
Well, look, I'm going there for a job, for a certain responsibility, and I take my responsibility seriously. So I'm going there to represent India at the SCO meeting, and that's what I'm going to do.
All right. I cannot end this conversation before I open it up for some questions without, of course, recognizing the presence of the one and only Professor Jagdish Bhagwati, who has come to listen to you, and as a quintessential supporter and spokesman for a freer world, having written powerful books on it, including the one which he wrote in the Globalization and its Defense of Globalization, as a kind of a rejoinder to Stiglitz's book earlier, which had talked about globalization and its discontents. The fact remains, Minister, that the world is becoming increasingly more and more protectionist and seeking to impose barriers. In such an increasingly more protectionist world, and notwithstanding the presence of Professor Bhagwati, how do you see the future of international cooperation and globalization going forward?
I think, and I'm not trying to split the difference here. At one level, actually, the world is getting globalized deeper and deeper because the supply chains are getting increasingly transnational. I mean, nothing serious is necessarily made in one country anymore. There are obviously big countries would be an exception to some degree. But on the ground, therefore, you have this interdependence, and on the digital era also an interpenetration. That what you say, what you use, what you process, what is recorded, also much of it doesn't anymore stay within your national boundaries. On the other hand, you have a sort of a social and political backlash against globalization because the manner in which globalization has been conducted for the last 25 years has led to a sense of job losses and a sort of dissatisfaction with quality of life in many societies. And that's translated into politics. So I don't think you're going to get a clean answer saying, is this going to win or that going to win? I think they're going to coexist with a lot of tension between the two. There's a third factor, which is that, globalized trade is not just globalized, it's also weaponized. So when trade is weaponized and finance is weaponized, people will take defenses against that. So one reason for protectionism, or I would say at least supply chain cautions or trusted digital certifications, would happen because there is an element today, national security has become a very pervasive filter through which economic transactions are now viewed. And the more economic transactions become technology transactions, the national security filter will only grow stronger. So I would argue that, let's look for efficiency, let's look for a sort of a smooth, well-functioning, well-oiled economic system. I think that era is behind us. People would compromise on economic efficiency for national security comfort, for privacy protection, and also in some cases they would rather keep the job at home, because that loss of jobs is a very powerful narrative in many geographies. So you are going to get, in a sense, the realities of globalization are going to collide with the forces of protectionism or globalization caution or hedging, call it what you want. And I think that's going to be a big part, that is already a big part of international relations. And most of all, you can see it played out between the US and China.
Well, Minister, with your permission, there are some questions, and if we can keep your questions very brief. Yes, Lord Nicholas Stern.
Thank you very much, Minister and NK. We all know and recognise and salute the outstanding presidency of the G20 of India, and within that, the very important proposition from the NK Singh and Larry Summers group, which was commissioned by the Finance Minister. And that's a landmark, it's a strategy, it's a program. Could you describe how you see India building on that, taking that forward, and in particular pressing the shareholders of those institutions to themselves press for the implementation of that plan? Because as we all know, the consequences for investment and sustainable investment around the world could be tremendous. In particular if they work well with the private sector. But could you explain how India plans really to take that great success forward and into implementation?
I can take 2 or 3 at a go.
All right. Professor Alan Kruger.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you, Mr. Minister, for an excellent talk. Very interesting and very encouraging about the way things are going and thinking about foreign policy. I was interested in your question about, or your response to NK's question about the international system and then the protectionism and all that, and agree with most of it, but I have a question beyond that. And that is, it has always struck me as strange that it was the big country in the world, namely the United States, that led the move after the Second World War for an open multilateral trading system subject to the rule of law. And the rule of law, of course, is to protect, helps it when it's enforced to the protection not of the biggest, because they could be bullies, but everybody else. But now that things aren't going well, as they should, as you would like them to, what's happening is that everybody's saying this is terrible. Everybody's saying that my country, the United States, has made some mistakes, which I think it has. But meanwhile, other countries are individually fighting and individually protecting themselves. And I cannot quite understand why a country such as India could not take leadership in uniting all of the rest of the world in saying, look, we want to keep open. We want to keep the rule of law. Yes, there are a few things that are needed for national security, but not everything. And right now, at least in my country, every protectionist in the whole country is running and using national defense as an excuse. And I think that some kind of multilateral move on the part of almost everybody, let us call it the world -2, could really make a difference in this, and that it's a right thing for India, which has been a leader right along internationally, to seize the leadership and to articulate the benefits to everybody of this. And right now is a perfect time, I think, because we already have the epidemic. That was shown to be worldwide and to be something we cannot individually solve. We already have other things, the climate issues, which cannot be solved on an individual basis. Why do we not get a coalition, instead of everybody fighting and running in their own corner to defend it, to move together and coalesce, maybe ignoring the two big bullies in the room?
I think that.
I'll take one more.
Yeah, all right. Yes, please.
Yes, you spoke about the desire to be part of many clubs, and then you spoke about protectionism and so on. So there are some obvious clubs in this region when it comes to trade. What is your view of the potential of joining those clubs?
Okay, next question. You know, look, I think what Larry Summers and K. Singh did was fantastic. Okay, they created a certain template, a pathway, a very serious prospect of how do we tackle what has long been debated. Your question is actually the next step. So what do we, what do we do with it? How do we take it forward? And I don't think there's a single answer. I think some of it rests with the G20 and the willingness of the G20 to prioritize this issue, use the report and its recommendations, and how do you take it forward. To some extent, I would say there has to be some degree of bilateral backup as well. There'll be some countries whose influence or where they stand will be very fundamental to the issue of reform and recapitalization. There would be, to some extent, you build up a kind of bottom-up pressure. I could see that at the Summit of the Future from a lot of developing countries, many of whom actually referred to the report saying, look, it's not like you guys don't know what to do. I mean, somebody has laid out a way out there. So I would say, ideally, we need a kind of all of the above answer for this to really move. To me, much of it is really to convince the key players, and I think we all know who they are, the key players to give it the priority. Because my worry is not, in a broad sense, people want to do it, but to make that actionable and then particularly in the US to create that kind of momentum, because if you are ultimately talking more resources, we are also talking the US Congress. So I would say that's broadly the space which I'd be looking at, which actually brings me in a way to the next question, observation. You know, I'm not sure I would go with the proposition that most things are working well and there are few things which need to be tweaked and there are one or two countries who are a problem. I don't think that's true. I think there are big issues in the international economy. Subsidies, fair trade is a very big issue. If there is today a reaction to a lot of this, it is out of a sense that the rule of law you refer to, I would say the rules of trade. The rules of trade are being tested by the reality of subsidies, by very opaque production centers. Now, opaque production centers both in terms of goods, even more so in terms of technology, in terms of data. So I think there are certain realities which it is not possible to gloss over anymore. We can't say, you know, the problem is in one country and one particular administration. I think there's a deep-rooted problem out there. Look right now, you have a democratic administration which has passed the IRA and the Chips and Science Act. Now, why have they done that? Because they actually have come to the conclusion that it's not possible to protect their interests in an international system which is being gamed or which is being subsidized or which is being manipulated. I think those are hard realities out there. So I'm not sure that this requires a neat fix and people coming together. I think it's a much deeper malaise, and if we do not diagnose the problem right, which actually brings me to the next, the third observation, the regional clubs. You know, when we look at some of the clubs, including the trading regimes on offer, I think a lot of our concerns are exactly the same. You know, how do we protect ourselves against export surges from a heavily subsidized economy? So today the rules are being tested against the reality of practices. So we keep saying, well, this is how the rules are. Well, those may be the rules. The realities are very, very different. And we can see that in the numbers. And for a country with the kind of per capita income we have, these are very big political and socio-economic risks that we are taking. Do you really want to expose your economy and your society to the reality of massively subsidized trade, which actually can, as I said, which can also be weaponized with certain purposes in mind? So trade is no longer trade. A lot of trade and a lot of technology, I'm afraid, you know, national security, like it or not, and some of the issues like subsidies and opaqueness, they are fair square in the middle of that conversation. And if we continue to duck it, we are essentially not moving in the direction of a solution.
Thank you. I think that there's a great deal of interest, so I'll seek your indulgence just by stretching the thing for a few minutes. Rajiv, first you, then Jean-Pierre Lando, then I think that Prachi, you had your hand up for a long time. Yes.
So I just wanted to perhaps be undiplomatic to the quintessential diplomat. What you've heard from Anne Kruger and Lord Stern is a sort of implicit plea for India to take a leadership position on the global south. But in a world that is so geopolitically fragmented, you have talked about the coalition of the willing. Why do we want to waste our time positioning ourselves as a leader of the global south? Why don't we very pragmatically focus on bilateral deals to actually address the single most important cross-border capital requirement, which is for climate? So climate transition, financing for that, my question to you is, what are your views, what is already happening, and what are the prospects for bilateral climate diplomacy for India to raise the cross-border funding it needs for our net zero transition?
All right. Thank you. Jean-Pierre Lando.
Yeah, Minister, you made a very impressive presentation on the relationship between technology and international relations. Now we're coming to the age of artificial intelligence. It's coming much faster than we had expected a few years ago. India will play a leading role in that field. Do you think it's time for some governance initiative, international governance initiative of AI, or is it too soon in the technological process to think of it?
Okay, Prachi.
Minister, I was really struck by something you said that, despite all these, discussions about fragmentation, deglobalization, globalization, the fact is that we are becoming very local because things spread in almost, there's such strong spillovers. So, that said, I think the world is getting divided into blocks, as you mentioned. So I was just wondering, next month, November 5, is a big global event, as you know. And, if Trump gets elected, which is, equally likely than not, how are we thinking about it? And do we, is it going to be more black and white relative to what it is now? Having us, being forced to be part of one of the blocks? Thank you.
Rajiv, look, I don't think being part of the global south is a waste of time. I'll tell you why. Because that very interdependence that we recognize in so many other spheres, after all, it does apply more than anything else to climate. When we say if something terrible happens somewhere, its effects are felt elsewhere. So I'm not sure that on climate action, either practically or in terms of, I would say, a certain outlook and a certain solidarity which has come over a period of years, it makes sense to say, well, I'm in this game all by myself and I'll cut the best deals I can. I mean, obviously, it's in the nature of things that every nation naturally prioritizes its interests, but I would argue that global south itself has great value on a range of issues. Again, I don't have to position myself as a leader of the global south. You are part of a collective, and if in the collective you are a trusted member of the collective and you are a articulate member of the collective, I think people expect you to do a little bit more. Again, I'm not entirely sure that some of the answers can be found bilaterally. So I would argue that yes, there are, forget bilateral, there are a whole range of unilateral solutions. There are clearly bilateral solutions. I mean, this month, for example, we will have our India-Germany consultations, and in the India-Germany agenda, climate actions and climate-related projects have a big there's a certain salience. It's to me not a either or, and I'm really not comfortable with the idea that you walk away from the global south. On the contrary, I see value. On AI, yes, there are already discussions about guardrails. I think governance may be a bit over the horizon right now, but clearly something so profound is going to require, at the minimum, some kind of international understanding. So after all, every big change, game-changing event in human history, eventually, once you have an international order which is able to communicate with each other and you have organizations, there is an attempt made to find some kind of common do's and don'ts, especially don'ts. So I can't imagine that the world will say something so big, let's leave it to a very Hobbesian solution. I think there would be an inclination to find at least a minimum kind of landing ground on that. On the issue, look, again, yes, there is the paradox that even as conversations and actually policies and realities about countries strengthening their national capabilities has grown. And IRA and Chips and Science Act are two very prime examples of it. There are still, these are not without the global supply chains. So what you're going to have is, in a way, a very interesting division. Parts of the global economy or the global supply chain are going to get a certain layer of comfort or trust or reliability on it. It may not matter to you very much where a glass may come from, but it may matter to you very much where your phone or your computer or whatever else comes from. So you're going to get a very interesting global supply chain divide, where there will be things which will be judged more sensitive. Now the problem with that is the world of AI is going to erode that very fast. But nevertheless, it will stay. And right now you can see, for example, like electric mobility. Electric mobility is now neither seen as electric nor mobility, it is seen as data. How do you protect the data emerging from that? So now you spoke about one possibility of the two in the American election. But I stress to you, look back over the last 5 years. See how many of the policies which in 2020 people thought were the Trump administration policies actually not just carried over by Biden, but they doubled down on those policies. So this is not just, a politician. It's not just a fashion. It's not just one administration. I think there are very deep shifts happening. This is Main Street America, which actually has made a shift geopolitically and in its economic outlook, and has come to the conclusion that the order which it itself devised many years ago no longer works to its benefit to that degree. So I would argue that irrespective of the outcomes in November, many of these trends will intensify in the days to come, and you are going to get, you can call it a more fractured world, but I would say in some ways reliability and transparency are going to be two very key factors which will become metric for countries to have, and enterprises and domains to have dealings with each other.
Well, thank you very much, Minister. Thank you for assuring all of us present here that the actual paradox lies in your skills and the agility with which you are able to balance the conflicting forces, asymmetric as they might be, in being both a protagonist for liberal economics and protectionist at the same time. We do not end this today with the kind of a sense of frustration which you mentioned earlier visits many parts of the United Nations, but a sense of optimism that the conduct of our overall international and foreign policy is in very, very skillful hands, which is able to balance these asymmetric forces with which you make India and all of us proud. All the very best to you, Minister.